There's a woman in an 1851 census. Her name is written as Catherine MacLeod Gillis. She's 38 years old. She's listed as born on the Isle of Skye, and she's living in Inverness, hundreds of miles from where she started, married to a blacksmith. The Isle of Skye in the mid 1800s was not a quiet place to be from. It was a place of clearances and evictions, of entire communities pulled off land their families had worked for generations, of a church that split in two and took its records with it, and of a Gaelic naming tradition so layered and complex that it can either hide your ancestors from you or hand them right to you, depending on whether you know what you're looking at. I went looking for Catherine's parents. 3 AI tools later, I had a working hypothesis grounded in good evidence, a clear explanation for why the direct proof is missing, and a very specific list of exactly what to search next. That's what today is about. Let's dive in. Welcome to Ancestors and Algorithms, where family history meets artificial intelligence. I'm your host, Brian, and today we are heading to the Scottish Highlands. If you have Scottish ancestry, especially Highland or Island ancestry, this episode is going to feel like someone finally handed you a map for a territory you've been wandering in without one. We're going to walk through the exact AI workflow I use for Scottish research. From orienting yourself to an unfamiliar archive system, to transcribing the handwriting in those old church registers, to correlating evidence across multiple documents when the direct record you need isn't there. And if you don't have a drop of Scottish blood, don't go anywhere, because the techniques we're covering today apply to every research tradition you'll ever encounter. The orientation prompt, the cross-document correlation, the honest assessment of what a partial answer actually proves. These are universal tools. So settle in. Here we go. Let me walk you through a scenario that illustrates exactly what Scottish Highland genealogy research looks like when you combine a solid AI workflow with records that range from beautifully preserved to frustratingly absent. Our subject is Katrina MacLeod. That's the Scottish Gaelic form of Catherine MacLeod, and it's the name her family would have used at home, even if the Church of Scotland session clerk wrote Catherine in the register. Katrina is a composite case, built from the kinds of challenges that come up again and again in Highland Scottish research. And if you've got MacLeods or MacDonalds or Morrisons or Cameron in your family tree, I promise some part of today's story is going to feel very familiar. We start in the 1851 Scotland census, which is on Scotland's People, scotlandspeople.gov.uk. That's Scotland's official genealogy website, and I want to pause for a second to make sure everyone knows it exists. Census records from 1841 through 1921, church registers going back to the 1500s, wills, valuation rolls, immigration records. It's the single most important resource for Scottish research, bar none. In that 1851 census, we find Catherine MacLeod Gillis. She's 38 years old, born on the Isle of Skye. Her husband is Donald Gillis, a blacksmith. They're living in Inverness, and 3 children are listed with them. Murdo Gillis, age 9, Mary Gillis, age 7, and young Katrina Gillis, age 3. Hold those children's names. Murdo, Mary, we'll come back to them. Catherine was born around 1813, and the question I set out to answer is, who were her parents? Now, before we go one step further, I want to give you some historical context for the world Katrina was born into, because the records of early 19th century Highlands do not exist in a vacuum. They exist in a very specific historical moment, and understanding that moment changes how you interpret what you find and what you don't find. The Isle of Skye sits in the county of Inverness-shire, off the northwest coast of Scotland. In 1813, it was almost entirely Gaelic speaking. The Church of Scotland held services in English. Some schooling existed, and it was in English. But at home, in the fields, in the fishing boats, people spoke Gaelic. They told their stories in Gaelic. They understood their family relationships through a naming tradition that was centuries old and deeply tied to who their people were. The early 19th century was also the period of the Highland Clearances, the large scale evictions of crofting families to make way for sheep farming. On Skye specifically, multiple landlords served over 1,700 writs of removal, affecting tens of thousands of people in the 4 decades following 1840. Some families moved to coastal townships on the same island. Some immigrated to Canada or Australia. Some moved to Inverness or Glasgow or Edinburgh for factory work and trades. A blacksmith's wife born on Skye who turns up in Inverness by 1851 fits this historical pattern exactly. And here's something that the clearances created for genealogists, something that AI can help you navigate. A diaspora that scattered people from the same parish across multiple continents, left behind place names and family connections embedded in naming traditions rather than written records, and produced a documentary record that stops in one archive and picks up in another. Understanding the historical forces is not only interesting background, it's the research strategy. In Kilmuir specifically, the northern tip of Skye where Katrina's family lived, the land was largely worked by crofting tenants who owed their tenure to Lord MacDonald's estate. A crofter wasn't a freeholder. He could not sell his land, he could not improve it without permission, and could be removed if the landlord chose to use the land differently. This precarious position shaped everything: where families stayed, when and why they left, and what records were kept about them when they moved. And then there's the church. Before 1855, Scotland had no civil registration, no government mandated recording of births, marriages, and deaths. That didn't begin until the 1st of January, 1855. Before that date, the Church of Scotland kept what are called Old Parish Registers, or OPRs. These are the records of baptisms, marriage proclamations, and burials, kept parish by a session clerk whose diligence, honestly, varied enormously from one place and one decade to another. The OPRs for Highland parishes like Kilmuir on the northern tip of Skye can be extraordinary, or they can have significant gaps. And in the 1840s, something happened to the Church of Scotland that created a genealogical problem that researchers still bump into today. I'll explain that in a few minutes. But first, let me show you how we started the search. Because remember what we always say around here: AI is your research assistant, not your researcher. What AI can do is help you understand the landscape of a research problem before you start digging. It can map the territory. It can surface the historical forces that explain the gaps. That context saves hours. Sometimes it saves days. And that's where we went first. The first tool I opened was Perplexity at perplexity.ai. And I want to explain why, because the choice of tool is intentional. Perplexity is my go-to when I need to orient myself to unfamiliar research territory quickly. It searches the live web, it cites its sources, and it can synthesize context from genealogy guides, archive documentation, and historical resources in a way that would take me an hour to assemble manually. The free version is completely capable for this kind of orientation research. I also had the Comet browser open on my laptop, which lets me research right alongside any ScotlandsPeople page I'm viewing. Comet is free as of 2025, available for desktop and mobile, and worth knowing about. Here's the prompt I gave Perplexity. Read it carefully because the construction of this prompt is part of the lesson. Prompt number 1. Quote, I am researching Scottish Highland ancestry. My ancestor Catherine MacLeod appears in the 1851 Scotland census in Inverness, age 38, born Isle of Skye. That places her birth around 1813 in Skye. What are the most important genealogical records available for researching someone born on the Isle of Skye circa 1813? Please cover the following. What is available on Scotland's People, the significance of the disruption of 1843 for Highland genealogy research, Scottish Gaelic naming conventions I should understand for families in this era, and any historical context about the Isle of Skye in the early 19th century that might help me understand what records would or would not exist, end quote. Notice what I did there? I gave Perplexity a specific person and a specific research problem, a place, a date, and 4 distinct areas of inquiry. A vague prompt gives you a vague answer. A specific prompt gives you a specific one. What came back was genuinely a masterclass in Scottish genealogy. Let me walk you through the 4 things Perplexity surfaced that shaped everything that followed. First, Scotland's People. Perplexity confirmed the site holds the full run of OPR records for every Scottish parish, indexed from the 1500s through 1854. All 10 Scotland census records from 1841 to 1921. Statutory registers of births, marriages, and deaths from 1855 forward. Wills and testaments. Valuation rolls showing property occupiers. And something specific to the Highland experience that I was not expecting to see highlighted. The records of the Highland and Island Emigration Society, which operated from 1852 to 1857 and assisted thousands of residents of Skye and the Western Isles to emigrate to Australia. If your Scottish ancestors ended up in Victoria or New South Wales, this collection may have their names. I'll come back to it in the outro. Second, naming conventions. Perplexity confirmed a tradition that I'd read about but hadn't fully internalized. In Scottish Gaelic Highland families, there was a powerful tradition of naming children to honor grandparents on both sides of the family. The first son and first daughter typically carried grandparental names. Which side of the family went first varied by household. Some families honored the father's side first, others the mother's side first, and many mixed the pattern depending on who was living, who was closest, and sometimes who had helped pay for the wedding. There was no universal rule about the order. What the tradition does establish, reliably, is that grandparental names were recycled across generations. Go back to Catherine's children, her oldest son Murdo, her oldest daughter Mary. By the Highland Convention, those names almost certainly honor grandparents. The question is, whose grandparents? Donald's or Catherine's? That's what we still need to determine. And we don't know until we find out what Donald Gillis' parents were called. That's a key nuance, and I want to be honest about it. The naming tradition is a clue, not proof on its own. We'll come back to this. Third, and this is the one that changed the shape of the entire investigation, the disruption of 1843. In May of that year, approximately 474 ministers walked out of the Church of Scotland's General Assembly in Edinburgh and founded the Free Church of Scotland. This was called the Great Disruption, and it reshaped Scottish religious life permanently. And in the Gaelic-speaking Highlands and Islands, the Free Church took hold with extraordinary force. Skye, Lewis, the Western Isles, most of the Northwest mainland, these communities followed their ministers into the new church in huge numbers. Here's what this means for genealogy. The Free Church didn't keep OPRs. Their records are a completely separate collection held at the National Records of Scotland, and they are not indexed in the same way as the Church of Scotland registers on Scotland's People. If your Highland ancestors switched to the Free Church after 1843, any events from that year until civil registration began in 1855 may not be in the OPR. They are somewhere else, or they were not recorded at all during the upheaval of a congregation rebuilding itself without a church building without a stipend for the minister, and sometimes without anywhere to meet. For Catherine, born around 1813, the disruption doesn't affect her own baptism, but it absolutely shapes what happened to her family's records in the years surrounding 1855. And it shapes the absence of records we'll find later in this episode. Fourth, Perplexity explained the Gaelic form of the MacLeod surname. In Scottish Gaelic, MacLeod is written MacLeod. The female form used for daughters is MacLeod, which is a contraction meaning daughter of the son of Loud. So the same woman might appear as Katrina MacLeod in Gaelic context, Catherine MacLeod in an English language census, Kathleen MacLeod or Kath MacLeod in an OPR where the session clerk was abbreviating heavily, or even as Catherine M. Loud in some 19th century records where the apostrophe replaces the AC. Every one of those is the same person. That's why the orientation step matters. With that context, I went into Scotland's People and started looking. The 1841 Scotland census is on Scotland's People, and you can search the index for free. You pay a small fee of roughly $2 to view the original image, but the index will tell you whether the name appears and in which parish. That matters because you want to confirm you're looking in the right place before spending your research credits. I searched for Catherine MacLeod in Kilmuir. That is the northernmost parish on Skye, occupying the tip of Trotternish Peninsula. MacLeod families had deep roots in the northern parishes of Skye, and it felt like the right place to begin. She was there. In the township of Kilmalewag, within Kilmuir Parish, Murdoch MacLeod, age 55, crofter, Mary MacLeod, age 50, and Catherine MacLeod, age 25. Now, I need to tell you something important about that age of 25. In the 1841 Scotland census, the standard instruction was that adults over 15 should have their age recorded as the nearest multiple of 5 below their actual age. In practice, many people followed this exactly. Some gave their precise age, and some fell somewhere in between. The pattern to watch for: any age that is a multiple of 5, like 25, 50, or 55, could represent someone up to 4 years older than listed. So Catherine at 25 might actually be 25, 26, 27, 28, or 29. That places her birth anywhere from roughly 1812 to 1816. The 1851 census says she's 38, putting her birth around 1813. These line up. This is GPS element 4 happening in real time. I found an apparent conflict between two sources, and understanding the census convention resolves it as a non-conflict. But here's what matters most. In 1841, Catherine MacLeod is living in Kilmuir Parish with a man named Murdoch MacLeod, age 55, and a woman named Mary MacLeod, age 50. The age relationships fit for a parent-child connection well. Murdoch, born around 1786, Mary around 1791, marrying in 1810, and having a daughter in 1813 is perfectly plausible. And those names, Murdoch, Mary, go back to Catherine's children in 1851, Murdo and Mary. This is where I needed to verify something before going further. I needed to know what Donald Gillis's parents were named. Because if his parents were also named Murdo and Mary, the naming tradition evidence points equally to both sides of the family and proves nothing. But if his parents had completely different names, the Murdo and Mary and Catherine's children become significant evidence. A quick search on Scotland's People for Donald Gillis in Strath Parish, which is in the southeast of Skye and a historically common area for the Gillis family, turned up a household in an early return that identified his parents as Duncan Gillis and Effie Gillis, not Murdo, not Mary. That matters. If Donald's parents were Duncan and Effie, then a first son named Murdo and a first daughter named Mary can't be explained by Donald's side of the family at all. By the Highland tradition of honoring grandparents, those names almost certainly point toward Catherine's parents. The naming evidence now carries real weight. But I still needed documentary evidence connecting Catherine to the Kilmuir household. For that, I needed the OPR. This is where Gemini via AI Studio comes in. The Kilmuir OPR marriage proclamation section, like most Highland OPRs, is handwritten in dense, faded script that varies based on which session clerk was working in which year. The earlier entries from the first 2 decades of the 19th century tend to use abbreviations that are not always familiar to modern eyes. This is exactly the job Gemini 3 via AI Studio was built for. As of April 2026, Gemini 3 achieves a character error rate of around 1.67% on 18th and 19th century English and Scots handwriting. That is expert level accuracy. The critical detail is to access it through Google AI Studio at aistudio.google.com, not through the regular Gemini app or the Gemini website. The AI Studio gives you direct access to the full model capability without additional application level guardrails that reduce transcription quality and other interfaces. And it's completely free. When you upload your document image, use thinking mode for difficult records. It takes a few extra seconds, but the accuracy on faded or cramped handwriting improves noticeably. Here's the prompt I used when I uploaded the OPR page image I had downloaded from Scotland's People. Prompt number 2. Quote, I am transcribing a page from the Old Parish Register of the Parish of Kilmuir, Inverness-shire, Isle of Skye, Scotland. This is a Church of Scotland marriage proclamation register, approximately 1808 to 1820. Please transcribe this image exactly as written, preserving all abbreviations, original spelling, and punctuation. If any text is unclear or illegible, write the word illegible in square brackets. Where you can confidently identify a standard Scottish ecclesiastical abbreviation, expand it in square brackets immediately following the abbreviation. Do not guess at unclear surnames, end quote. 2 things to notice about that prompt. First, I gave Gemini context, the document type, the geographic and temporal setting, the specific record format. An AI with no context might misread an archaic abbreviation as something modern. With context, it understands it's working with a Church of Scotland proclamation record from a specific era and region. Second, I gave it an explicit instruction for uncertain text, write illegible in brackets. That single instruction protects me from fabricated readings of smudged or damaged words, which is where AI transcription most commonly goes wrong. Gemini came back with a clean transcription of the full page. And about 2/3 of the way down, here's what it found. Murdoch MacLeod and Mary Morrison, both in this parish, were proclaimed in order to marriage the 9th and 16th and 23rd days of December 1810. James MacLeod, witness. There it is. Murdoch MacLeod and Mary Morrison, proclaimed for marriage in December 1810 in Kilmuir Parish. A proclamation in this context means the banns were read on 3 consecutive Sundays, which was the Church of Scotland's requirement for all marriages. The actual wedding would have occurred shortly after that 3rd proclamation. Murdoch MacLeod and Mary Morrison married in Kilmuir around late December 1810 or early January 1811. Catherine MacLeod was born around 1813. The chronology fits. I also want you to notice something about what Gemini transcribed beyond the names. The entry includes the word, both in this parish. That phrase matters. It tells me these 2 people were both residents of Kilmuir at the time of the proclamation. They weren't from different parishes, which would have required a different administrative process. Both Murdoch and Mary were established Kilmuir residents before they married. And the witness, James MacLeod, was likely a close family member. That's the kind of contextual detail a transcription unlocks that an index alone never could. Gemini also correctly flagged 2 abbreviations, JAMES for the abbreviated first name and WITNES for the word witness. I would not have been confident in those expansions myself from the image alone. Having them identified explicitly in the transcription, with the brackets making clear these are Gemini's interpretations and not original text, is exactly what you want from a transcription tool. It preserves accuracy and signals uncertainty in one pass. Now, I took everything to Claude. This is where the GPS framework comes fully alive, and this is what I find most powerful about Claude for genealogical analysis. Claude can hold multiple documents in its attention simultaneously and identify the connections and the tensions between them. I gave it everything we had. Prompt number 3. Quote, I am researching Catherine MacLeod, born approximately 1813, parish of Kilmuir, Isle of Skye, Inverness-shire, Scotland. Here's the evidence gathered. Document 1, 1851 Scotland Census, Inverness. Catherine MacLeod Gillis, age 38, born Isle of Skye. Husband, Donald Gillis, blacksmith. Children, Murdo Gillis, age 9, Mary Gillis, age 7, Katrina Gillis, age 3. Document 2, 1841 Scotland Census, Township of Kilmallock, Kilmuir Parish. Household includes Murdoch MacLeod, age 55, crofter. Mary MacLeod, age 50. Catherine MacLeod, age 25. Note that 1841 census ages for adults were often recorded to the nearest multiple of 5. Document 3, Kilmuir OPR Marriage Proclamation, December 1810. Murdoch MacLeod and Mary Morrison, both of this parish, proclaimed for marriage. Additional note, research into Donald Gillis's family indicates his parents were named Duncan Gillis and Effie Gillis, not Murdo and Mary. Additional note, no baptism entry for Catherine MacLeod, born approximately 1813, has been located in the Kilmuir OPR, and very few MacLeod family entries of any kind appear in the Kilmuir OPR after the early 1840s. Please do the following. First, create a comparison table showing how the ages across the two census records align or conflict. Second, analyze whether the naming pattern of Catherine's children supports the identification of her parents, taking into account that Donald Gillis's parents were not named Murdo or Mary. Third, evaluate the overall strength of the circumstantial case that Catherine MacLeod Gillis is the daughter of Murdoch MacLeod and Mary Morrison. Fourth, explain what genealogical gaps remain. What might explain the near absence of this family from the OPR after the early 1840s, and what archives I should search next, end quote. Claude's response did exactly what I was hoping it would do. Let me walk you through each piece. On the age comparison table, Claude flagged the 1841 Census Convention immediately, noted that Catherine's recorded age of 25 represents a possible actual age of 25 to 29, and calculated that birth years of 1812 to 1816 are all within this range. The 1851 census age of 38 points to a birth year of approximately 1813. Claude assessed these as consistent within normal variation for 19th century age reporting, and specifically noted that without understanding the census convention, a modern researcher might wrongly treat these as conflicting evidence pointing to different individuals. On the naming pattern, with Donald Gillis's parents confirmed as Duncan and Effie, Claude assessed the name evidence as meaningful. If Catherine's oldest son is named Murdo and her oldest daughter is named Mary, and those names cannot be attributed to Donald's family, then by the Highland Convention of honoring grandparents, these names most likely point toward Catherine's parents. Claude noted this was strong circumstantial support for the identification, but is not direct proof, because naming traditions were followed inconsistently and families sometimes honored other relatives. On the overall strength of the case, Claude described it as a well-supported working hypothesis. Multiple independent lines of evidence point to the same conclusion: the shared household in the 1841 census, the naming evidence now that Donald's family has been ruled out, the OPR marriage of Murdoch and Mary Morrison in the right parish and the right time frame, and the geographic consistency between Kilmuir and Catherine's stated birthplace of Skye. Claude rated this as a reasonable basis for proceeding with research, but correctly stated that without a direct baptism entry or another document simultaneously naming Catherine and her parents, this remains probable rather than proven. And then Claude did something that made the whole investigation snap into focus. In answering that fourth question, why would a family nearly disappear from the OPR after the early 1840s? Claude connected two things I had in the prompt but hadn't explicitly linked. It said, quote, "The timing you describe is consistent with the disruption of 1843. Kilmuir was a strongly Gaelic-speaking community, and these communities were among the most enthusiastic supporters of the Free Church. If Murdoch and Mary MacLeod followed their minister out of the Church of Scotland in 1843, their records after that date would not be in the OPR at all. They would be in the Free Church collection at the National Records of Scotland, held under reference CH16. The absence of records in the Church of Scotland registers after 1843 may not mean the family disappeared. It may mean they changed churches." End quote. I went back and looked at the Kilmuir OPR. Almost nothing for this MacLeod family after the early 1840s. Perfectly consistent with a family that went Free Church after the disruption. That's not a failure. That's a discovery. We have now learned something specific and historically grounded about who these people were and where their records are likely to be. Now for the dead end I want you to see honestly. I searched the Kilmuir OPR for every year from 1812 to 1817. Every variant spelling, every abbreviation, nothing appeared. The Kilmuir OPR for those years is fragmentary. There are sections where entries exist and sections where the page coverage is visibly incomplete. This is typical of Highland OPRs, where registration was inconsistent, depended on the diligence of individual session clerks, required payment to record in some periods, and was not universally observed even by Church of Scotland families. The absence of an entry does not mean the family wasn't there. It means the record wasn't made, or was made and didn't survive. GPS element 1 includes knowing when you have genuinely exhausted the available sources in a category. I searched every OPR image for Kilmuir in the relevant years. The entry's not there. That is the part of the honest record of this research. So here's where we stand. This is a partial answer. And I want to spend a moment on why that's not a defeat, because I think the genealogy community sometimes treats partial answers as failures. They're not. They're an honest account of what the evidence actually supports. What we found through AI-assisted investigation is genuinely significant. We identified a Murdoch MacLeod and Mary Morrison who married in Kilmuir Parish in December 1810. We found a Catherine MacLeod in the 1841 census living in the same parish in the specific township of Campbells in a household with Murdoch and Mary MacLeod at ages consistent with them being her parents. We confirmed that the names of Catherine's children, Murdo and Mary, cannot be explained by Donald Gillis's family background and align directly with the Highland naming tradition pointing toward a father named Murdo and a mother named Mary. We have a geographic consistency, chronological consistency, and naming pattern consistency across multiple independent sources. The circumstantial case is solid. But we don't have the direct proof. No baptism entry linking Catherine by name to parents Murdoch MacLeod and Mary Morrison. And that distinction matters enormously in genealogy done to professional standards. This is exactly what the genealogical proof standard is asking us to do. Not to find evidence, but to evaluate it honestly. To say, here is what I know, here is what I believe with good reason, and here is what remains unproven. That intellectual honesty is what separates a family tree worth trusting from a chain of hopeful guesses dressed up as fact. Claude's summary said it clearly. The preponderance of evidence supports the identification of Murdoch MacLeod and Mary Morrison as the probable parents of Catherine MacLeod Gillis. This relationship should be recorded as probable in any genealogical database entry, with a research note documenting the evidence and specifying what direct documentation is still needed to confirm it. That is a soundly reasoned, coherently written conclusion. That is GPS element 5. The conclusion follows from the evidence, it accurately describes the evidence's limits, and it maps exactly what needs to happen next. I know some of you are nodding along right now. You've been exactly here. You found the right family in the census. You found the marriage that fits. And then the direct baptism record isn't there, and you're left with strong evidence and no clear answer. You're not doing genealogy wrong. That wall is part of the landscape. The question's not whether you can always find the direct proof. The question is whether you understand the evidence you do have well enough to describe it honestly, and whether you know enough about the archive system to know where to look next. Today, AI helped with both of those things. Your homework for this week. If you have Scottish ancestry, go to ScotlandsPeople and find one ancestor in the 1841 or 1851 census. Look at their household. Note all the names and ages. Then go to Perplexity and ask it to explain what OPR records exist for that specific parish, what the disruption of 1843 might mean for your research in that area, and what the Highland naming tradition might tell you about the names of the people in that household. That's all. See what you learn. If you don't have Scottish ancestry, run this same exercise for any unfamiliar research territory. The orientation prompt, giving Perplexity a specific person, place, date, and 4 distinct questions, is the most underused AI technique in genealogy. It costs 5 minutes and it can save you days. And for those of you keeping track of the methodology, today we demonstrated GPS elements 1, 3, 4, and 5. Reasonably exhaustive search. When we combed every OPR year in range and honestly reported finding nothing. Analysis and correlation of evidence. When Claude built the comparison table across 3 documents. Resolution of conflicting evidence. When we understood the census rounding rule and used Donald Gillis's family to validate the naming pattern. And soundly reasoned conclusion. When we stated clearly what we know, what we believe with good reason, and what remains unproven. That framework is what separates solid research from guesswork. And AI helps us work within it faster than we could before. And for my Australian and UK listeners, today's research territory is especially yours. UK researchers, ScotlandsPeople is your primary starting point, and the National Records of Scotland in Edinburgh holds the free church registers and Kirk Session archives that go far beyond the Church of Scotland's OPRs. The Highland Archive Centre in Inverness is worth knowing for local Inverness-shire collections. For my Australian listeners, particularly those in Victoria and New South Wales where thousands of Skye and Lewis immigrants settled in the 1850s, the Highland and Island Immigration Society records on ScotlandsPeople list many of those immigrants by name. The Public Record Office Victoria holds ship arrival records for the period. And Trove, the National Library of Australia's free research archive at trove.nla.gov.au, has notices from Scottish immigrant communities that can make connections no other source reveals. Thank you so much for listening to Ancestors and Algorithms. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you know a fellow genealogist or family history researcher who could benefit from what we covered today, share this episode with them. That is the best way to help our community grow. Now, for my Patreon members, the companion guide for this episode is in your library. 12 advanced prompts, including a full multi-tool workflow for correlating OPR and census evidence across multiple Scottish parishes, a GPS research checklist built specifically for pre-civil registration Highland research, and detailed case studies for working through the free church records and the Kirk Session archives. And if you've been thinking about joining, I host monthly live Q&A sessions on YouTube exclusively for members where we work through research problems together. Head to ancestorsandai.com to learn more. I'm your host, Brian, and I will see you next week for another journey into the past powered by the future. Until then, happy researching.